Right now, a woman, it might be you, is reading the symptoms of adult ADHD and recognizing every single one. She's 46 and she's in perimenopause. Now, she's not sure if she has ADHD or is just perimenopause. The similarity of symptoms isn't a coincidence. By the end of this video, you will understand the fascinating connection between estrogen, dopamine, and ADHD. I'm a neurobiologist. I've spent more than 15 years in clinical research, and what we're talking about today is the connection I wish I'd known about years ago. Before we get to ADHD, we have to talk about estrogen and dopamine. Once you see that, the ADHD piece is almost obvious. Estrogen is a reproductive hormone, but it is also a neuromodulator. A neuromodulator is a chemical messenger that changes how strongly brain cells or neurons communicate to each other. A neuromodulator cannot simply turn a signal on or off. Instead, it helps adjust the activity of brain networks, making them more or less responsive depending on the situation. Think back to when you first started puberty. From that very moment, when you were a teenager until now, estrogen has been keeping your brain's chemistry in balance every day. For 30 or more years, it has dictated how you process thoughts, how you manage your emotions, and even how you remember your life. You don't remember your adult brain without estrogen. And dopamine is estrogen's partner in crime that shapes how your brain responds every day. As a modulator, estrogen turns the intensity up or down of the dopamine signaling. And that's a key. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical message between neurons. Like our language is words, neuron language is chemicals. Dopamine is made in two small clusters of neurons deep in the brain. These neurons send projections to three other regions in the brain that regulate your feelings. It is happening in your brain at this very moment as you're listening to me speak and reacting to what you're hearing. The first structure is striatum. It handles motivation and reward. The second structure that dopamine neurons connect to is the limbic system. It handles emotion. And finally, the third structure is the prefrontal cortex. It's the brain's region sitting at the very front of your brain, right behind your forehead. You primarily use it for paying attention, ignoring what's not important, making business decisions, or being able to have series of complex thoughts from start to finish. So what we call thinking runs in the prefrontal cortex, and it uses dopamine. The relationship between dopamine and prefrontal function isn't linear. It's an inverted U-curve. Too little dopamine, your executive function is impaired. And too much dopamine, your executive brain is also impaired. What you want to be is at that sweet spot at the very top of the U-curve of dopamine availability. When you sit at the sweet spot, you are at your sharpest. Now, let's connect estrogen, our neuromodulator, and dopamine, our neuronal messenger. Estrogen and estrogen receptors are found throughout your brain. Estrogen modulates dopamine using different mechanisms. Understanding these mechanisms will help you understand ADHD better because dopamine deficit is one of the most important pillars of ADHD. The first mechanism, I call it make. Estrogen tells your dopamine neurons to make more dopamine and release more dopamine when they talk to each other. When estrogen levels are high, neurons produce enough dopamine. And optimal levels of dopamine mean more fuel for motivation, better emotional control, and most importantly, more fuel for executive function. So make is the first mechanism by which estrogen regulates your dopamine. Estrogen turns up dopamine production and release. The second mechanism, I call it keep. This one is about how long dopamine sticks around when it's been released as a message from one neuron to another. After dopamine delivers the message, enzymes break it down and clear it away. Estrogen slows those enzymes down. When estrogen is high, enzymes are working slower, which means dopamine sticks around longer. So keep is the second mechanism. Estrogen slows the breakdown of dopamine. The third mechanism, I call it hold. This one is about what happens to dopamine once it's been released and has delivered its message. It's essentially a second way of how to clean up the dopamine left over. Your neurons have a protein called the dopamine transporter, which has a job to vacuum dopamine back out so it can be recycled. The faster the vacuum machine runs, the less time dopamine has to signal before it gets pulled away. Estrogen lowers the number of the dopamine transporters. When estrogen is high, the number of vacuum machines is lower and dopamine stays longer in the synapse. When estrogen drops, the transporter numbers rise, more vacuuming is happening, and dopamine gets pulled away before it can fully deliver its message. So hold is the third mechanism by which estrogen regulates your dopamine. Estrogen slows the dopamine vacuum and keeps dopamine around longer. So let's summarize the three mechanisms by which estrogen regulates your dopamine you just learned about. Make, keep, hold. Estrogen tells your dopamine neurons to make more dopamine. Estrogen slows the enzyme that breaks dopamine down so each molecule is kept active longer. And estrogen slows the dopamine transport of vacuum machines so dopamine that gets released is held in the synapse longer. All three mechanisms are running at the same time. The result is a brain where dopamine is being produced more readily, sticking around longer, and signaling more strongly. Your individual sweet spot on the inverted U curve is being actively maintained by estrogen. It's been maintained for 30 or more years, every single day. If this is helpful, subscribe. And if you know someone who needs to hear this information, send it to them. That's how this channel can grow. Now, what happens to make, keep, and hold in perimenopause? You can probably already guess the answer. Fluctuating and eventually falling estrogen during perimenopause weakens make, keep, and hold dopamine mechanisms. Three mechanisms that have been running your brain dependent on estrogen for 30 years are losing function at the same time. This is the biological reality of perimenopausal brain fog. You lost your sweet spot on the U curve and your brain is running on less dopamine. And if you were to describe what that feels like day to day to a doctor who didn't know you were in perimenopause, you describe trouble focusing, trouble holding a thought, trouble starting tasks, emotional volatility, and lack of motivation. A doctor hearing that list with no other context has a very specific condition in mind. They've been trained to recognize it, and it would be ADHD. ADHD is largely a dopamine deficit syndrome. Dopamine isn't the only molecule involved in the ADHD. There's another whole family called catecholamines, and norepinephrine in particular plays a major role in attention and impulse control. Please comment if you would like to hear that part of the story in another video. The brain of someone with ADHD makes less dopamine, breaks it down faster, and has a less responsive dopamine transporter system. Does that sound familiar? Those are the same three mechanisms we just walked through: make, keep, and hold. ADHD is what happens when those mechanisms are running at lower capacity from birth, not because of hormones. This is exactly why ADHD looks the way it does. The prefrontal cortex is sitting just below that dopamine sweet spot on the inverted U curve. Because of that gap, the people with ADHD have problems with attention. They drop what they were doing in the middle. Their working memory isn't great. And what should be automatic, like executive function, feels like an uphill climb. Essentially, people with ADHD are trying to run the same brain circuits as everyone else, just with less fuel in the tank. The fuel meaning dopamine. Now, let's combine the two stories together, the ADHD story and the estrogen dopamine story. If you have ADHD, your brain has been running with less dopamine your entire life. Your prefrontal cortex is below its sweet spot on the inverted U curve. And then estrogen arrives at puberty and starts running make, keep, and hold more efficiently. Estrogen doesn't fix ADHD. The underlying problem is still there, but estrogen adds a layer of support, enough to push you closer to the sweet spot and enough to keep you above the threshold where symptoms become disabling. If you have ADHD for 30 or more years, you've been running on ADHD plus effort plus estrogen. During perimenopause, estrogen stops supporting your brain. Your compensation strategies that worked for 30 years stop working. The ADHD that was always there becomes unmasked, and the timing is cruel. Perimenopause arrives at the moment your life demands are at their peak. Just think about it. Your career is at its most complex. You're still taking care of your teenage kids. You're also taking care of your aging parents. The estrogen support is pulled out at the same time that you are already carrying a maximum load. What if you never had ADHD in your life, but you started experiencing exactly the same symptoms in perimenopause? One study gives us some clues. Epperson and her team ran a small randomized double-blind clinical trial. They looked at 32 women who were in perimenopause or early postmenopause. None of them had a history of ADHD. They simply had what Epperson called new onset executive function complaints, such as brain fog, trouble concentrating, and working memory failures. She gave half of the women ADHD medication, lisdexamfetamine. The other half got a placebo. Then they crossed over after 4 weeks. Women that were on medication got a placebo, and those that were on placebo now got active medication. Surprisingly, women without ADHD responded to the ADHD medication as if they had it. They saw a major boost in their executive function and their ability to remember words. Their brain scans showed that the medication activated their prefrontal cortex in the exact same way it does for someone with diagnosed ADHD. It suggests that during perimenopause, the prefrontal cortex is struggling in a way that is biologically identical to the ADHD brain. So this means that estrogen withdrawal all on its own can create a brain that looks and acts like ADHD brain, even in someone who never had it before. Estrogen isn't just a background player. For some women, it is doing the heavy lifting. The normal mental clarity you relied on wasn't actually your baseline. It was your brain plus estrogen working together. Now that estrogen is leaving, you're discovering what your brain's baseline looks like on its own for the first time in 30 years. If you're worried, you should get tested for ADHD. The key difference between unmasked ADHD and simple perimenopausal brain fog is that ADHD is lifelong. The symptoms were there long before the hormones changed. Your brain has been running on estrogen for 30 years, and you didn't know it was there. Some of you have always had a brain that needed more dopamine support, and estrogen was doing that work. Some of you had a brain that was perfectly fine, and the estrogen withdrawal alone is enough to produce a cognitive picture that looks like ADHD. The most important thing to remember is this. Whether what you're experiencing is ADHD, perimenopause, or a combination of both, the goal is not to judge your brain. The goal is to understand it well enough to work with it. If this video helped you understand your own story a little better, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will see you next time.